I'm here with this very esteemed panel to talk about hard tech. So just to kind of give a quick intro to that, and I will introduce the panelists. They will talk a little bit, won't just be all me, but you may have heard Mark Andreessen is setting up an office here in London. No pressure, Saul. But he famously said more than a decade ago in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that software is eating the world. And that, of course, is true to a large extent, because when we think about tech, our minds often go to software. There is so much value being generated in software, so many people making money from it. But of course, there is also an enormous market for physical products and technology, whether it's consumer devices like Apple's new Vision Pro, a very exciting new device, to physical buildings, to engines, to robots and laboratory equipment. But of course, these kinds of businesses are quite challenging because they're expensive to run. They can have quite low margins, unless, of course, you're NVIDIA making GPUs. Their margins are around 70%, which is insane. And just to kind of really drill down on the definition, we are talking companies that manufacture tangible products and technologies, and they often require scientific and engineering expertise. So it's kind of a multifaceted approach to the types of skills that the people who run these companies need to do. It is a tough job. So just to kind of get the discussion going, one challenge that occurs across both software and hardware is what problem is your startup actually solving? We see a lot of startups that come up, they bring out a product, and the product is looking for a problem to solve. So maybe we'll just start with you, Hayaatun, because you're with the Royal Academy of Engineering. So you're not a founder per se, but you work with a lot of founders. So what does that mean for the founders you work with?
Absolutely. So the first thing I'd say is how excited I am that we're sitting here today talking about hard companies rooted in hard technology, solving hard problems that matter to all of us. That's pretty much our sweet spot at the Royal Academy of Engineering. And when we started our enterprise hub, which I did co-found back a decade or so ago, actually the problem we were trying to solve is that we could see these really smart people who had exciting, high potential technology that could meet real societal challenges, and the problem was this was just so unattractive to investors. And so it's been really, really fantastic to see this kind of curve of progress in terms of the recognition that actually being in it for the long haul, accepting that these are often expensive, sometimes higher risk than other types of investment opportunity, that's for us really important progress. And typically, the types of challenge that our founders are trying to solve are focused on clean tech and sustainability, and then med tech and life sciences. So they're the two biggest areas. But having said that, what's been really interesting to see over this past decade is how much the sectors that they're trying to solve those challenges in have evolved as well. So for example, we're seeing construction coming up as a big opportunity sector, $10 trillion market, why wouldn't it be, and an undisrupted one. We're seeing agriculture coming up. Again, it matters so much. Food security is now much more front of mind than it was a few years ago. And so we're seeing this change in both the kind of technologies that are coming to market, but also in the sectors that are now interested in seeing how could those technologies transform what we do.
It's been a long time coming, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's, real estate and agriculture is not something you, maybe a little bit agriculture, but those aren't areas you would typically associate with being disrupted by tech. Moving on to Mostafa, who's the co-founder of Automata, a robotics firm. Can you tell us a little bit about what problem Automata is solving?
Sure, and thanks for having me here today. Just a quick aside to start, as a architect in my past life for 10 years, this is not the panel I expected to be on with Thomas Heatherwick, but I'm grateful to be on it nonetheless. Automata is a life sciences robotics startup based here in London. What we work on is automating the manual processes that happen in a lab as much as possible. So, the kind of hyperbolic line we use in Automata is if you walk into a laboratory today, like we're across the street from one of the best in the world, the Francis Crick, it's like walking into Marie Curie's bedroom, whenever that was, right? A person hunched over a desk doing experiments. Now, obviously that's an exaggeration, but that's what you'll see if you walk into the Francis Crick today. And what Automata tries to do is to automate as much of that work as possible to make it faster, more accurate, and more collaborative. We just heard about life sciences and biotech investments here in New Palo Alto, and that's definitely a theme we see as well. And what's also happening is this experimentation is happening at a new scale with the rise of machine learning in biotech. And when you can do 1,000 experiments a minute digitally, it doesn't make sense that you can run an experiment a week in vitro in the lab. And automation can address that in terms of scale. It can also address the repeatability part, which is as this work becomes more collaborative, there's a shocking statistic that approximately 50% of teams in the life sciences who publish their own results cannot replicate them because of how finicky the work is in a lab. That's a technical word. And that's what we do at Automata. We introduce robotics into the laboratory to remove the menial work, but also to empower scientists to do more meaningful work and have access to more scale information and results.
And that's an actual phenomenon, right? The so-called reproducibility
The
crisis.
reproducibility crisis
Yeah,
is a thing people are really concerned on.
And automation can help be one solution towards solving
It's part of the solution.
Moving on to Thomas Heatherwick of Heatherwick Studios. Tell us about what problems Heatherwick Studios are solving.
Yeah, so does this work? Is this working? As I was given this.
No?
Yes, it is, good. Yeah, so
Up to a point.
so I started my startup 29 years ago and moved to a place that I thought was called King's Cross 22 years ago. And I've now discovered today I live somewhere else than I thought. I've lived here for over 20 years and worked with my team. We have 280 people now. But our problem that really motivated me, and I couldn't see anyone else to work for back 29 years ago, was that the built environment around us seemed to be getting more and more sterile and soulless and less human. And so I set up a small organization trying to think how we could work on, in a way, the hardest thing, which is the buildings that are around us. There's so many stories we tell ourselves, so many logics for why the places weirdly, I mean, wherever you go in the world, if you go to the new bit, I don't mean the single opera house or the rich person's house, but the new area, it's always soulless, almost without exception. And so we are trying to develop the skills and ways to influence others to realize that, because everyone feels so powerless, but also in our own work to try to find the techniques to make built environment around us. And I really mean the outsides, because the insides are so often very good. And you get people, you go into someone's building and they've got an amazing atrium and they've got an amazing auditorium, but the outside, which 1,000 times more people experience, isn't giving anything to the street. And now with the digital revolution, where the question of why cities exist, the public space of cities where we all come together and experience each other is so important. And it's more than just let's have some street trees and reduce car usage. The actual faces of buildings really matter. And so that's what my startup was based around.
And it's still a startup 22 years later.
We're always starting up, yes.
So I'm going to direct a question to both Mostafa and Thomas, since you're the founders here, although you are a co-founder previously. But when we talk about hard tech, there's the cliched reasons why these companies are so difficult to build. The cost, the kind of conservative approach from investors, perhaps, or the ultra-cautious approach. Is that all true? And what else is there that makes building these kinds of companies so difficult? Let me start with Mostafa.
Sure. Yeah, I would put the buckets of difficulty in the following way. There's definitely the financing bucket of difficulty. The way I see it is that's your job as a founder to tell that story in a way where you can receive that capital and get your company started. It's the price of entry. So, while it's great that the ecosystem from a capital perspective has moved towards hard tech, I don't think that's made it fundamentally easier to raise capital for these kind of businesses. I think early stage venture has always understood that it's about, at least the kind of early stage venture we've worked with, about the founders and the teams, and then the business model to a certain extent, especially later stage it pivots to the business model. So I think even as hard tech has got accepted, it's still down to like exceptional founders and teams to build those companies. So that seems to be a common dynamic that hasn't changed, and London has no shortage of that, thankfully. The second bucket of difficulty, I would say very quickly in my experience starting Automata, and look, it's a data point of one, is the cross-disciplinary nature of the team. So we often hear cross-disciplinary used a lot, and like I'm pretty sure it's very hard to start a software business, but the kind of skills you have to put together in a room when you're trying to develop, in our case, a robot, which is like kind of mechanical engineering, industrial design, safety, firmware, software, manufacturing. Those are very different mindsets of people you're putting together in one cross-functional team, but also they fundamentally move at different paces. And I think this is something I misunderstood early in Automata. That, look, it's one thing to say you're going to use agile methodology and force mechanical engineering to operate in the way a web team works. And you can do a lot of that and it gets somewhere, especially in team culture. But you have to let hardware be hardware at some point.
What does that mean, let hardware be hardware?
It takes time. It's fundamentally different to test. It has a very different set of real-world constraints that it respects, that you have to learn to respect. And I think we started Automata thinking we were going to bring hardware to us as much as possible. And I think the push and pull was somewhere in the neighborhood of 50-50. Like, we had to go to hardware a lot as well and understand and respect what it means to test a product you're going to put in the real world.
And just for context, you are a manufacturer, but you have pivoted to software recently, correct?
We still maintain manufacturing operations.
Okay.
I would
So
call
additive.
ourselves a hardware-enabled software business.
Okay.
Our key moat is we design our hardware and can design software on top of it, which allows us to do things people who are hardware agnostic cannot. So yeah, like learning over a period, I would say 3 to 4 years of like, okay, I have to understand how this works, move towards it, but try to keep what's special about Automata special.
Okay. And Thomas, any further thoughts on that, and particularly on investment, the kind of perspective from investors when you're dealing with them? What's that been like?
That's the bit I probably know least about.
Okay.
The hardware is harder.
Yeah.
It's because we have lost. Maybe maybe it was intuitive before, but we've increasingly, as society, lost our ability to realize how important loving things is. And so I think so many in the tech startup world, products come out, and it's the importance of the physical object is misunderstood, and your emotion as a critical function is something that we are less and less used to understanding how to deal with. And the cliched image of the founder is of someone who doesn't understand emotion at all. And the really successful businesses really understand the emotion of the consumer. I'm talking more consumer things, but just as an example, and it's a great one to talk about Palo Alto, if we, I don't know how many people have been to Palo Alto, it's rubbish. I mean, the buildings just drive around. You've got to drive around because there's nothing, everything is disconnected. I went for the first time when we started working with Google on their new headquarters buildings, and we were so full of excitement. And then you kind of were just shocked that this place that had changed the world tolerated such bad public environment. There seemed to be anywhere to come together was really cheesy, or if it was new. And there was just one at Palo Alto High Street. You know, you could cling to that because that was old. But everything new, spread out, terrible use of land, driving everywhere. And so I think that's something that here is. I think it was a genius of Sir Paul Nurse who set up the Crick there, which was they could have been a collection of different medical organisations, and they would have been based out near the North Circular, you know, right on the edges of London, and that seemed logical because it's just scientists. And then they stopped and thought, well, to get the best talent, scientists aren't just technical people; they are cultural people, and culture matters. And so the idea of putting the best scientists in the world in the heart of the culture of a city. I mean, Palo Alto can never compare to this 2,000 years of history that we have around us that just enriches our lives and hopefully gives inspiration for why everyone knows Apple, their genius is understanding emotion as a design firm is more than the manufacturing or any of the other things they've been involved with.
Actually, I wanted to ask you about that, because when you first started speaking about that, it reminded me of Steve Jobs and his popularizing this idea of appreciating the beauty of a product and really having a very high bar for creating a product that consumers will love and will see beauty in. Do you think that idea has kind of, I don't know, faltered over time, or just isn't capturing the imagination of entrepreneurs as much as it used to?
Well, I think that to do anything well is really hard. And so you easily get lost in the hardness that you understand. And it's just, we don't talk about the emotional experience and exceptionalness enough. And we forget that I think there's too many people think the public are ignorant. And I think it's a really big problem, and somehow think that everyone else is, what do they call it? Non-player game player.
NPC,
My children
yeah.
are doing this
Yeah.
thing of it. Anyway, but once you believe that everybody, they may not be trained in design, everyone can spot something that is exceptional, then you've really got to think about what that is, and that's the kind of thing someone's going to really want and be willing to stick in their bathroom rather than think, why would I have this stupid bit of plastic in the bathroom? And there are certain tech events where you get given your goodie bag and you think, oh, wow, I've got this goodie bag, and inside are all these gadgets and plastic things. And one by one, you take them out over the following week or two, really look at them, and they end up in the bin or kind of to put in the jumble sale, car boot sale. And one by one, you end up throwing all of them away. You think, oh no, what? All this attention and care because none of them connected emotionally with me. And I think that's just so critical. I mean, it's critical in the software, but the hardware, so I can see why everyone avoids it as much as they can and say, oh, no, we don't invest in hardware.
Yeah.
And you can so much to get wrong, but my instinct is you rush towards the harder problem to solve. That's more interesting. I think that's what you've done as well. And I think that more people need to believe that exceptionalness matters and that love is the key to people really being a customer and engaging with what you do, whatever you do, whether that's buildings, buses, or I guess even business to business things.
Or goodie bags. Hayaatun, yeah, please.
I love what you're saying, Thomas. I was just going to go back to your question about what's hard, distinctively hard about hard tech. And one of the other factors that we haven't got to yet on the panel is that you might be doing something that is the first of its kind. So it can be really hard to make the case for something that doesn't exist, and where there are no reference points to give confidence that this is going to be a thing that is worth backing. So if I just take one example, we've got a brilliant Enterprise Hub member, Inasa Mohammed. Her company, H2Go Power, was the first in its class looking at hydrogen-based energy storage using, it's like battery storage, but really smart catalytic technology combined with hydrogen. And so she's got to go out there and pitch to investors saying, you know, this is going to be amazing. But most of them don't know anything about hydrogen. They don't know much about energy storage. And so that speaks to the challenge that some of these founders have in talking to an investment community that isn't specialist enough in those technologies to even necessarily want to assess whether this is something they want to back. So we see two kind of cliff edges. One is when companies have to migrate off public funding. So Innovate UK, for example, the Academy, we support at the sort of the R&D side of it, the innovation side. But when you have to wean yourself off that into follow-on funding, growth funding, that's really, really hard to navigate. And the second cliff edge is there are some great specialist hard tech, deep tech investment funds now at the early stage. But then when you have to move to the generalist growth funds, it's much, much harder. And so one of the things we're trying to do at the Academy is just to have investor fellowships so that we can help build capacity in generalist funds to give more confidence and more kind of flow of people between these worlds so that you've got more kind of common language between you to have the right kind of conversation. And then the final other point I'd make is a lot of hard tech is so expensive and requires such a lot of capital investment, you're probably going to have to do it in partnership with corporates at the very least. So there's a huge culture change piece there. We were talking about culture, but if you have to transform the construction sector because you've got some absolutely fantastic technology, that's a big challenge. You're engaging with companies who don't have this track record of knowing what to do with innovative startups, and so I think there are layers to this.
Can I add to that? Because a lot of what you said was triggering to me. Both
Oh, sorry.
both positive and negative, because I've been
need to
through a lot of that
Yeah.
that you just described. First of all, on the corporates, they're a massive problem, and they're part of at least in our experience. So, but I do have an answer to that in a second. But what I would say is the startups I work with now, like 7.5 years later, 8 years later, who are back where I was 8 years ago, the thing I try to instill in them the most or give advice on the most is like, do not lean on the crutch of difficulty. I see so many founders do this, which is like, I'm doing this the first time ever. No one's ever done this. And it's like, I understand.
Yeah.
And between you and your closest and you and yourself in that shower, like, that's okay to go there. But like, it's not okay to go there with your teams. That distills a culture it's very hard to get rid of.
You mean sort of like a martyr mentality?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's so hard to get rid of that culture. Like, we're doing something no one's ever done before. Sounds amazing in the beginning, but then your teams start to lean on it. And it's like, of course, it's taking me a year longer.
Right, yeah.
And it's like, okay, I did that. And then the second thing is like, what I was alluding to in the beginning is like, value proposition is value proposition. And sorry to use ugly B2B words, but like, you can describe a value prop even without the tech. And go get that as quickly as possible. So a lot of I kind of only work with robotics companies because I really don't understand anything else. And what I do make them do if they listen to me is like, don't develop any tech. Go become what's called a system integrator for 6 months. Like, do what's available on the market. You'll learn so much more that I guarantee you V1 is going to be so much better.
And on that, I think we are going to move on to talking about the positives of hard tech.
Yes.
We've talked a lot about the challenges, but before that, it's a little bit cliche to try and compare New Palo Alto, London, Europe with Silicon Valley. But let's go there. Question to anyone on the panel: do you think it's easier to build a hard tech company in the UK or in the US? Let's stick with the UK.
I think from a funding perspective, it's definitely more difficult
In the UK.
in the UK.
Yeah.
I would say, but you actually need a lot less capital to get you where you need to get to here in the UK. As we've grown bigger and we've started to set up in the US, I don't know how anyone builds anything out there. It's so expensive. And there's incredible talent here.
So you mean just for staff costs primarily, right?
And talent
Staff is
availability,
cheap.
right? There's people graduating from incredible universities here who don't think they have those options. Like, if you go try to set up in Palo Alto and you're trying to recruit out of Stanford, they have options. And so, but here, with we've seen this with Imperial, the Dyson School, Oxford, Cambridge, as we've moved towards the life sciences. Even, we've recruited from Birkbeck, a ton of places. People expect that their career is going to be, I'm going to graduate from here, I'm going to go work for an Aston Martin at best, or, a lot of people here go into like the aeronautics businesses, and for them to find like something interesting that looks like their education in central London, you suddenly become incredibly more attractive than that stable job at Rolls-Royce. So I think actually Automata would have found it harder to set up in Palo Alto than here in London.
And Hayaatun, did you have something you wanted to
I
add?
also think that when you aren't the first mover on something, you can also leverage that to some advantage. And in the UK, I think what we see in our founder community is people also want to be able to embed their culture and values in their companies. So we have a lot of startups who are founders who are passionate about inclusion, for example, and sustainability, and they want to hardwire that into their business from the start. And I think in some ways it's easier to do that in the UK because we haven't got we're not sort of trying to turn around a culture. It's still emerging. It's still growing. And I agree with you very much, Mostafa, that the quality of talent in the UK is extremely high. So we find internationally lots of companies want to recruit from the UK because they say, for example, the engineering talent is amongst the most creative in the world. So it's not that it's a given that it's easy or hard. I mean, it's going to be hard. It's going to be great, but it's going to be hard. But there are things that you can leverage in the UK that I think can make it a more positive experience here.
Give some examples of the things you can leverage here.
So there's quite a lot happening outside places like this where we're more aware of it. So if I take Belfast, right? Belfast may not be on all your radars, but they have an extraordinary capability around cybersecurity there that they have built out of their university. And by being creative about saying, what do we want Belfast to be? What's the culture we want to create here? What are the outcomes for people who live here? How can we attract multinationals to come and invest here and create jobs? And so, that's really interesting. Go look at Glasgow and what's happening around photonics and quantum. And because of the kind of civic ownership and the sense that this is necessary for our region to thrive, it has a different flavour to it, to what you would find in Palo Alto. And I think looking for hooks like that and using those as leverage, I think is super exciting. We see a lot of very, very talented people doing exciting things in places you wouldn't necessarily know about in the UK.
Okay, great. And that kind of speaks to the point you were saying earlier about the multidisciplinary need for talent. There's so much talent in all the different regions, just in the UK alone.
Like Bristol and robotics.
Bristol,
is
absolutely.
huge.
Bristol and
example.
robotics is another one, yeah. So I love the examples, but let's go back up to the 10,000-foot view on building hard tech. What is great about doing it? Why should anyone put their money into these kinds of companies, whether you're a startup founder or you're someone who's going to work for one of these companies or you're an investor?
I'm in the lumbering industry of architecture most of my time. So you're saying, why would people invest? I'm in the lumbering area of architecture where there's so little technical innovation so often. But sorry, what was your question?
Well, I guess in your case, why should people put their money into something like that has a physical outcome and the type of company that you're working with, a hard tech company rather?
Well, I think Apple's a pretty good example of why the hard technology, making something that people connected with beyond their head, and actually just sheer lust and desire and the storytelling creates one of the biggest, most successful companies in history, is a pretty good reason why. But what's interesting is to try to spot the areas that others aren't spotting, and where there hasn't been that. And Tony Fadell with the thermostat. So I'm always interested in finding a mindset where you don't expect it. And so he applied it to thermostats and created the most gorgeous object that you didn't want to hide in a rubbish airing cupboard, but actually people proudly put on their wall. And so the physical was as important as the function of the way it worked. I'm enjoying this framing also of new Palo Alto as a way to think, and because I've been here the whole time and not seen it, I felt very lonely. I mean, I had someone in my team who he'd moved down from the north of England to work with me, and he had come to the UK from Iran during the revolution, and this area, I mean, had only just had a march to try to stop people thinking it was only about drugs and prostitution. And he had worked in his brother's kebab shop for a while when he was a teenager, and he was an amazing project manager, and he worked with me. But the food around here, there was nothing. So he slept on the floor of my studio, and went back to his wife at the weekends in up north, and ate nothing but kebab because there was nothing else to eat. And he ended up in hospital.
Oh, God.
Because he'd eaten so much kebab for lunch and supper and lunch and supper. But now look out at what you can eat here. I mean, what a transformation. So this cultural depth without driving in a big, fat, stupid car, to be able to just walk into something. So that richness. But I'm also fascinated by connectivity versus isolation, because when you look at some of the most amazing teams that have made incredible breakthroughs, they are not hyper-connected. they wanted to be in a bubble somehow. And so for talent reasons, you need to be somewhere where there's lots and lots of people around.
Yeah.
But for focus reasons, you also want people to not be looking out of the corner of their eye at the wine bar around the corner, or the hipster tattoo place or whatever it is. And so how you create isolation within that has been something I'm interested in. So you can create focus because you need a level of unreasonableness to get to exceptional work.
Okay. So the rewards are, some examples of the rewards, just the enormous success of Apple, and the beauty of some of the products that it and Tony Fadell's Nest made.
It's also,
Oh, you want to go
you know,
ahead?
it's also, deep tech, hard tech companies are IP rich. It's much harder for new entrants to outcompete. So that's another advantage. And then flip it on its head, and you see we have some really hard problems in the world around us, and we can't solve them by carrying on doing what we're doing just slightly better.
Yeah.
So take construction, as Thomas has been so articulate in describing how it touches our lives, but the built environment, it accounts for 40% of global carbon dioxide emissions. We are not going to fix that problem by just simply doing what we do 1% better. And so you need disruption. That's a huge, huge opportunity. So that market has not been disrupted yet. It is starting to be. You see investment in construction tech has gone up like 85% in the last 2 years. And a lot of that is deploying AI to increase productivity and efficiency. But we will go further than that. And there's stuff that needs to happen, for example, in terms of material use. So cement, concrete is a big part. It's what, 7% of global carbon dioxide emissions. We need to have new tools available to us. Hard tech is how we get the new tools.
Good answer.
I think the rallying cry for hard tech is pretty obvious to me, right? There's 3 ways, like, if I can go through all 3 very quickly.
Oh, it's okay.
The first is like, the problems we have to solve primarily reside in hard tech, right? Whether it's we're going to solve cancer, we're going to solve climate change, we're going to solve the future of transport, we're going to solve where we live in the future and how we live in those spaces. Whether, all those things involve a component of hard tech. Let's move away from just hardware. They're underpinned by what we call hard tech. The future of computing. I know we're all excited about generative AI now, but you mentioned quantum. Like, that's all hard tech. Even generative AI and all that kind of stuff is a hard tech discipline.
It requires a whole bunch of GPUs.
Right? So the rallying cry is pretty obvious. If you want to work on something that matters, chances are you're looking at a hard tech endeavor. And for you to get there and work on it is also easier than it's ever been. Democratization is a real trend in this market, whether it's access to 3D printing, or it's access to GPUs, or it's access to programming, whether through ChatGPT or people who know how to program. That's easier than it's ever been to get these things off the ground. And then for the investors, I think we're seeing 2 things, like an increased awareness in the investor community that we have to invest in things that have cultural and societal returns as well, beyond capital returns. And I think, for example, where we sit today has a deep understanding of that. And then second is like, look at the top 50, 100 capitalization companies in the world. Like, they have some underpinning of stuff out there in the world as well. Whether that's Apple, who's primarily a hardware business in a lot of ways, but I know that's changing, but it's underpinned by hardware. Whether that's Google, who's investing more and more in these kind of things, or it's the companies we don't like to think about that no one remembers, but there's still...
Or Microsoft's cloud infrastructure, which was fundamental to OpenAI being able to create GPT-4.
Hard is not a dirty word. Hard should be attractive more and more, right? I think that's how we should think about it.
I think that's a great way to end our panel, actually. So if it's not too cheesy to say, Mark Andreessen might have said software is eating the world, but it sounds like hard tech is making the world a better place?
Yeah.
Yes, can do. All right, thanks so much to our panel, and thanks to everyone for listening.